So in today's short video, which is especially important for those of you that are studying for your E2 and your E3 exams, we're looking at ways that businesses can ensure they have a strategy to make sure they're competitive. And to do that, we're going to be looking at Porter's generic strategies. Now, I'm sure that you've heard about Michael Porter before, but before I tell you any more about Michael Porter, I want you to say hola to Isabella, because Isabella is a cider maker in Spain, and she manufactures cider because, very luckily for her, all the apple orchards within 50 miles are owned by her uncle. And this uncle, he loves Isabella, so he gives her a discount on the trade price. And he also won't supply to anybody else. Lucky Isabella. So when a rival cider maker sets up in Isabella's town, they've got nowhere to buy apples from within 50 miles. So they have to transport more expensive apples from further away. And of course, this isn't cheaper, is it? They're adding costs by transporting the apples, by the complexity of their supply chain management, so ultimately they're gonna be less profitable. So what we can see is that Isabella's relationship with her uncle has given her a competitive advantage. And now, competitive advantage is when, as I've just put on screen for you, is when a company or a business has an advantage over its rivals when competing with them in the same marketplace. And in order for a business to be successful, it's vital that they have a competitive advantage, because if they don't, in the long run, their competitors certainly will do. Those competitors will attract your customers, and businesses without a competitive advantage will no longer be able to trade. So we saw with Isabella, her competitive advantage, her advantage over her rivals, is the fact that she is able to get really cheap apples for her cider, which means the prices of her cider can drop down, and competitors are going to find it really difficult to compete with her unless they can find their own competitive advantage. So what we're going to look at in this section is Michael Porter, because he suggested there are two really basic types of competitive advantage, and they're cost leadership and differentiation. Now I'm going to say that wrong later on, but I think I said it correctly that time. Differentiation, fantastic. But as this is just a short bite-sized video, we're just going to focus on cost leadership in today's video. Now, what exactly does cost leadership mean? Well, basically, it's making sure that you are able to supply a product or service cheaper than your competitors can. Now, what we're not saying is that a company are the cheapest in what the customer would pay for the product or service. Cost leadership concerns the fact you're able to produce the goods or service at a cheaper price. It's not necessarily that you're selling them, it's just that your internal costs are the lowest. And you can see I've just put an example here of Ryanair, the Irish company who supply cheap airfares. So they provide no frills air flights. All you get on the plane is a seat, but although that doesn't sound very luxurious, doesn't sound like a lot of fun, there's no food, no drinks unless you purchase it separately, it's really good for people who like to travel but don't have that much money, or don't see the value added in the service that more expensive airlines provide, such as maybe more legroom or food included in the flight. Because of course, on Ryanair you can choose not to eat, you can choose not to drink, because all you're paying for is the seat itself. Now, the impact of cost leadership is that if you are selling your product or your service at a market price, what do you think the impact is going to be? You've got the lowest internal costs, but you're selling at the same price as your competitors. Well, so I've gone on too far. That's right. You're making higher profits. Of course, your margins are much larger. So it stands to reason, doesn't it, that in times of falling consumer prices, that the market leaders are going to be able to sustain their profitability far longer than their competitors and survive where other companies may fail, because they have a much bigger margin of safety. So if profits started to fall, they still have that safety net of a greater margin than their competitors. Now, it's also worth noting that companies that are operating a cost leadership strategy are able to pass their savings on to the consumers if they wish. Of course, this means that their profits margins will decrease, but conversely, their market share will increase as more customers are attracted to the cheaper prices. So now let's have a look at the way that a company can become a cost leader, because that sounds really good in principle. I'm sure you'll agree. Just have lower internal costs than your competitors. Easy. Well, firstly, you'd have to make sure that you've made enough investment in your machinery, because of course, to reduce your costs, you need to make sure you're as efficient as possible. If we return to the Ryanair example very briefly, huge amounts of time and effort are focused on boarding passengers as quickly as possible, boarding passengers and their bags as quickly as possible, in order that they can turn the flight around, make more flights in a day, and also pay less time for staying at the airport, because of course it costs an airline to be using the airport. If you're manufacturing products, of course, part of this would be to design those products to make for as efficient manufacturing as possible. And so hopefully what you do there is make sure that if you think of a company like IKEA, each of their products is designed to be manufactured as easily as possible, so it can be sold as cheaply as possible, so it can be sold as quickly as possible, and they can remain cost leaders. It's also really important to have efficient distribution channels, because then you're minimizing the sales and the distribution costs. You also want to source low-cost supplies, because now let's think back to Isabella and her example. Her cider rival couldn't have supplies as cheaply as Isabella. They couldn't source apples cheaper than her. So their product has to cost more internally. Now, if Isabella is setting the market price, consumers know how much they want to pay for cider, the competitors will have to match that, and of course their internal costs are higher, but they're selling for the same price, so they're not making as much money. And the last one is economies of scale. So mass production of things, your goods, would really bring down the costs of manufacturing, which means you can sell at a cheaper price if you wish, or sell at the market price and just make higher profits. So there we go, that's cost. Now, as I said earlier on, Porter said there are two different cost advantage strategies: cost leadership and differentiation. Now, this is just a short video, so we're not going to move on to differentiation, but it's something you really need to make sure you're familiar with before you go into either your E2 or your E3 exams. Now, if you are interested in receiving more E2 and E3 short videos like this one, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your revision. Leadership.